Welcome back to part 2 of the Introduction to Organizational Theory. I'm Dr. Bethany Floor. It's great to be with you again. This slide presentation just builds on part 1 a little more about post-secondary organizations before we get into the Bowman and Deal presentation. Reminder that the reason we study organizational theory is to improve our practice as leaders. Theory is only as good as it is useful. A reminder that Bowman and Deal and the work in this class at the beginning is to present organizations through multiple realities. We'll be using 4 different multiple realities. That irrational people lead what we hope to be more rational organizations, and the use of organizational theory in our leadership skills will help make organizations more effective and more rewarding places for people to work and more successful organizations. We discussed earlier in part 1 that the ability to match frames to certain situations serves leaders well, and often senior leadership teams need people who have very diverse ways of looking at situations, and as such, we do tend to have a dominant frame preference which influences the way that we often react and respond to certain situations as leaders. So classes like this give you opportunities to take risk. You get to become more familiar with organizational theory and expose yourselves to ways of thinking about the organizations in which you lead in ways that maybe are different or that are something that you haven't really considered before. So just a reminder of why we're doing what we're doing in this class. Now, some of this I'm sure is very familiar to you, but I wanted to take the opportunity in this presentation to remind us of where we are and kind of the culture and the climate and the organization of higher education in general. So here are some characteristics of post-secondary organizations. We are a loosely coupled system as well as a very highly specialized system. We have a plethora of units, many with very different purposes. Bowman and Deal, in their work, if you've gotten this far, suggests that Harvard University is a form of Mintzberg's professional bureaucracy. Now, I've added an editorial here that I may disagree a little bit with the authors today, given the fact that Harvard, which was an every tub on its own bottom institution, a very decentralized institution, has likely evolved because of recent compliance efforts, probably in the past decade alone. Higher education institutions have been faced with compliance challenges that require true standardization across all of the organizations within the academy. And so, in addition to the compliance efforts that require institution-wide standardization, there's also been a great emergence and growth within the techno structure of the academy, probably in the last decade. So, if Bowman and Deal and I were having coffee, I might ask them about their perspective of Harvard, given today's climate of higher education. Now, the next set of slides, I want to take you through the organizational characteristics of the post-secondary institution. Again, a reminder, I know this is all very familiar to you, but kind of setting the stage as we prepare our work together. We do have, regardless of the type of organization, whether it's a community college, a for-profit, a nonprofit higher education entity, in general, each organization has evidence of this tripartite mission. Some, like as far as the land-grant institutions, may have stronger service and outreach components or legs, but in general, we can say that the organizational characteristics of higher education has this tripartite mission: teaching, research, and service. And the way you see this manifested typically in the organizational language and behaviors is that in teaching, we all know it's the 4-credit academic programming. And you'll hear we are preparing the next generation of leaders and scholars, although lately it's all about workers. We are preparing the next generation of workers. But that is the teaching mission of the institution. Research, often the language that reflects the research mission of institutions, is as the driver of economic development. And that can either be locally, regionally, often it's a statewide driver if you're talking about a public institution, and obviously industry. So we have a lot of tech transfer programs. Perhaps the academy has become somewhat of a more linked R&D department to organizations than they ever have been before through the use of sponsored research funding and tech transfer, private dollar funding to support research that goes on within the academy, and then the emergence of public-private partnerships that enhances this driver of economic development for the region or the state. The third mission area of post-secondary organizations typically is a service mission. And again, this is regardless of whether it's a community college or a for-profit or a not-for-profit, a public or a private. Almost every I cannot think of one. Actually, that would be a good essay question to get you all to think of one example of an institution of higher education that does not have some service component to it. And often if you hear Dr. Nolan speak, or you'll hear institutions and some of their slogans will say that we make lives better for the region or for students, faculty, staff, the community, and the world. Places where higher education exists, where there is an academic entity, tend to be much more desirable as places to live. And you have the community programming, the arts programming, a lot of non-credit programming, your summer camps for kids, clinics, museums, outreach, engagement. Again, the land-grant institutions often have a really strong link to agriculture or other outreach efforts in the community and for the state. So this tripartite mission is what we are comprised of in a very broad, I'm talking 30,000 foot level here, as post-secondary organization. Now I'm drilling down one level to discuss then within the academy there are these units. And this is not all-encompassing, but I want to take some time to talk through these very three broad senior management areas. Just keep in mind that reporting lines and titles will certainly vary depending upon the institutional tradition and other factors such as the centralization of that institution, or even in the state, whether the state is centralized or decentralized, the types of governing structures that exist. But again, in general, this is what you're going to find within any unit of higher education. So within any college or university, you'll typically find these three broad senior management areas. The academic affairs area, which the president generally oversees the provost, that then oversees colleges. And within academic affairs, you will see different subunits or reporting units. Certainly, these can vary, again, depending on the type of institution, but research often falls under academic affairs. Sometimes it falls under administration, but academic support units also fall under academic affairs. And you note here that, and Dr. Nolan needs to be giving this presentation, but you note here that I have provided some sources of funding because it's important, I think, when we discuss higher education, that we consider the way these three different areas are funded. So under academic affairs, most of our funding is education in general, or E&G, state funding, the state allocation that we receive as a public institution of higher education. And then, of course, tuition dollars. We're going to talk more about where tuition dollars are linked in another slide, but I wanted to just draw out here within this broad category of academic affairs in general. These are the sources of funding. Now, if you have research, sponsored research as part of academic affairs, you'll naturally have federal funding, sponsored research, public, private, federal funding there as well. The next area is student affairs. And often, not always, but often, there's a reporting line between the president and either the provost and then the vice president of student affairs, or the president directly to the vice president of student affairs, and then all of the many different student affairs organizational units. If you're curious about the many different student affairs organizational units that exist, go to the CAS Standards website, the Council for the Advancement of Standards for Higher Education website. This website provides most of the co-curricular units that exist on an academic campus, and you can see, I think there's something like 42 units listed. Again, some of these may report, depending on the institution, up to academic affairs. Some may report up through administration. Financial aid is one that, depending on the place you look and the hierarchy that is there, you may see it reporting to different offices. Here at ETSU, athletics is considered a student service activity, and so I've highlighted athletics under student affairs, but that can show up in other places as well. And then all of your student affairs units. And And most of the funding, however, not all, but most of the funding for these units are auxiliary units. So they're considered self-supporting. They generate income. They are kind of a unique funding model. And there's also, of course, state dollars that are often allocated to the work of this area. And then tuition and other things that come in. But I just wanted to highlight here that it's generally under student affairs that we see the auxiliary funding show up, and not necessarily in academic affairs. In athletics, in particular, the auxiliary funding is a big part of collegiate athletics. And then the third area for this broad senior management area presentation here for this slide is administration. And this is kind of what I call the back office, business office area. So the president, the provost, or the chief financial officer, perhaps the chief operating officer, and then all of the many organizational units that are kind of organized around the administrative services of the institution. Sometimes this can be things like technology. Other times you'll see technology report to academic affairs. But definitely offices such as budget and planning would fall under this administrative category. So tripartite mission, teaching, research, and service, and then 3 units: academic affairs, student affairs, and administration. Let's switch up a little bit then and move away from the units, the kind of organizational what, to the people that make up post-secondary organizations. This is something that I almost did not do a slide on because I thought, gosh, this is so intuitive, but I think it's worth mentioning the types of people that work here within this organization. We mentioned in the kickoff video how complex the academy is as an organizational structure. Right here, when I'm presenting to you, the people, the nature of workers within the academy is really vast, which adds to its complexity. And so the use of organizational theory is a one way to kind of rotate through the people who work within the academy, especially when we're using the human resource frame. So we do have faculty. Just a reminder here that full-time tenured and tenure-track faculty tends to be what the rest of the world considers as a measure of institutional quality. And when I use the rest of the world, I also mean external and internal. So internal meaning like regional accrediting bodies, for instance, look at the number of full-time tenure-track faculty. But externally, U.S. News World Report, parents, when they want to know how many professors that their students will actually be seeing, or will it all be GAs in their classes? I mean, those are the kinds of questions that parents care about. So both internal to the academic community and external to the academic community, this measure of full-time tenured and tenure-track faculty is a pretty big deal across academia when it comes to conversations around institutional quality. But there are often very strong contributors to the faculty that are also part-time roles. And these come notably through professional faculty, those who work in business and in industry who are so giving of their time and they'll come teach part-time for programs, clinical faculty, lecturers, and adjuncts at all. I've put various levels of support. Then we move into staff. We have clerical support staff. We have professional staff. Students make up who our people are, graduate, both traditional and non-traditional, full-time and part-time students. Undergraduate students make up the people of who comprises post-secondary institutions, and then administrators. And there's a lot of dialogue in the academy right now. If you get on Inside Higher Ed, for instance, and read any article and go down to the comments, you're going to see administrative bloat. At least one person is going to comment about the administrative bloat within the academy. I would argue that a lot of administrators are being hired to address what we've mentioned earlier, the compliance initiatives that are happening through state and federal compliance requirements. But administrators are also being hired to do the things that faculty no longer have time to do. As faculty are being pushed to be more active in both research and service outreach activities, we're finding that it's been important to hire administrators who can pick up some of the load for the faculty. So people who are full-time advisors, people who are full-time recruiters. No longer do we have a dean of students who was a faculty member, as in the old models of higher education. We are hiring seasoned professionals who've had academic training in student affairs to be our dean of students these days. And so this level of people around administration has really grown probably in the past 2 decades. And we have within each organization, within a college or a university, it's important that you know there's a central administration, which is your president, your provost, your vice presidents, and then there's unit level administration. And these are your deans, your chairs, department heads, and directors. So another way to look at the organization of higher education is through programs. So we've talked about the tripartite mission, we've talked about units, we've talked about people, and now we want to talk about programs. And this is something that in the Strategic Planning Committee, I've arm wrestled people over, just being real with you guys, because I was trained that a program is what makes a student, and indeed it is true. You would not be a student here at this institution if you were not enrolled in a program. So academic programs, for-credit academic programming is what makes a student of higher education. I know that might sound silly for me to even mention it, but you'll see why I'm saying it later on. So being enrolled in an academic program, for-credit academic program, is what gives you your financial aid eligibility and athletic eligibility, as well as things like live-in dorms on campus. So someone off the street cannot come move into a dorm, although we have heard stories of that, and live here if they're not enrolled in an academic program at this institution. Academic programs are what we look to as measures of institutional quality. So programmatic quality is often what universities and colleges are known for, in addition to their athletic teams. Academic programs are the driver of the largest source of funding for a university. This is where your tuition and fees come in. So students enroll in a program, students pay tuition and fees. Tuition and fees are the largest source of funding for most universities today, with the exception of some community colleges. For-credit programs, again, I want to contrast between not-for-credit and for-credit programs. We're talking here about for-credit academic programming as being what is the core function of the academy, with the subsidiary or side dishes of non-credit programming that is also a very important service component of the institution, professional development, summer camps, things like that. And then I guess you can see the bias in me. I have all other programs here, but it is true. You cannot be in a student affairs program here necessarily if you're not enrolled in an academic program. And you can't partake of the athletic programming here. I cannot be a college athlete, for instance, if I'm not enrolled in an academic program. So there are all these other programs here on campus and at every other institution on their campuses that are really important, critical for engagement of students, for the retention of students, and for the overall well-being of students. So the programming is very important, but I want to draw your attention to the fact that you are a student of higher education because you are enrolled in an academic program. These things are important to consider, and I'll tell you when the discussions get difficult, typically in resource discussions, this is where I have found that reminding ourselves of what we do and where we want to put our focus and where we'd like to put our locus of control as leaders. So if you put your focus on the academy under the mission, right, the tripartite mission, and you're having conversations, and I hope you start to learn this language because I'm getting ready to dance over in the political frame here for a minute. But if you're having resource conversations around mission-related activities, the question becomes, what mission do we not do? And by the way, the ETSU Strategic Planning Committee probably started its first 3 meetings saying, what are the activities of the institution that do not fall under our mission? And we actually found none, because the mission is broad. That teaching, research, and service mission is so broad. So if you put your focus and your locus of control as a leader around the mission, it's very hard to answer what mission do we not do. If you put your focus and your locus of control as a leader around the organizational units, then you have to have questions around, what units do we not need? That's also a very difficult conversation to have because it's very easy to establish the significance and importance of each of those units within academic affairs, student affairs, and administration. If we put our focus around people, This is very delicate because then you have to talk about, well, who do we not need? Do we not need faculty? Do we not need staff? Do we not need students? Do we not need administrators? I mean, that's the one everyone goes to. But when we're out of compliance, you need SACS administrators. And so this is a hard conversation to have if you put your focus around people. So how I was trained and what I was taught was to always keep your focus on programs. If you keep your focus on programs and the line of sight with your locus of control is in excellence in programs and services, it's much easier to have conversations related to programs. I just give you that tidbit of kind of mentoring and training that I received, and I have found that it's effective. And by the way, when the Strategic Planning Committee surveyed the entire ETSU academic community, I mean, it was a broad-based survey, and we asked the academic community, faculty, staff, students, to talk about the number one strength of ETSU. So we did a SWOT analysis: strengths, weakness, opportunities, and threats. The number one strength that came up was academic programs. So just saying, keep our focus on the programs. Keep your focus on the programs, the administrative programs that you offer, the athletic programs that you're offering, the professional development programs that you're offering. It's so much easier to have conversations around excellence in programs and services than it is about people or units. And the last piece of this presentation that I want to talk about, which we would, I wish we were in a face-to-face class for this, because this is where I wish we could break and have a really great discussion and hear your thoughts about these things. So what are we making in the academy? So if we're using organizational theory to look at the organization of post-secondary institutions, we need to come to some agreement about who are our consumers and what is our product. So this last slide that I'm presenting is a discussion that I love to get into about our consumers and our product. We all know, and Slaughter and Rhodes actually wrote this book, Academic Capitalism in the New Economy, but they basically said what we've all experienced in the academy, that students are now consumers of higher education, that knowledge is a commodity. And there's been a lot of dialogue about public good, the public good for higher education versus the private benefit of higher education. And when you see state funding declining, it's because people believe that there's more private gain. So students need to have skin in the game. They need to pay their own tuition. They need to help pay for the benefits that they'll then receive economically upon the awarding of a degree. And so Dr. Noland, I've heard him talk about the longstanding tradition of this debate between public good and private benefit, and hopefully he'll do that in a presentation here. I'm not going to go deep here, but just to draw your attention to the fact that there's been a true shift historically in the United States between the belief that higher education is a public good. In many ways, the state should fund it. It should be as low cost as possible to all walks of life, all students, whether rich or poor. That has changed drastically probably since the 70s to becoming this more private benefit model of higher education. And this goes for both public universities and private universities. And I have heard a lecture a long time ago, I wish I could remember who it was, that said we did this to ourselves in the academy. In the 70s, enrollments were dipping, and we began in the academy to do a lot of economic analysis studies. We were the ones in the academy who kept telling the world, get a degree and see how much money you'll make, get a degree and look how much more money you'll make. So we started that argument. We were the ones who said a degree equals more money. And so the private benefit conversation actually began with the academy. So in a way, it's now we did it to recruit students, and now we're being held accountable for keeping up to our word. And so that's just something worth mentioning. I want to talk here about products versus consumers. So are we making a product, which would be a degree, higher education as a degree, and students are the consumers? That's certainly what I believe. This is open for you to have your own opinions. But if we are considering that a bachelor's degree, a master's degree, a degree is the product that we make in higher education, then we are working with what we call in business an inelastic good. Inelastic goods are goods that have no readily available substitutes. And I've given you some examples here. Think back to your old economics classes if you had economics back in the day. Inelastic goods examples are like electricity, not really great available substitutes for electricity. Banking, unless you count putting money in your mattress, not a lot of readily available substitutes for banking. I think Jaguars are an inelastic good. Inelastic goods, because there are no readily available substitutes, you cannot find an easy substitute for a college degree, right? Because they're inelastic goods, they do very funky things in their pricing. You'll see if you Googled price elasticity studies for higher education, you're going to see a lot of research out there, because price in inelastic goods do not have the kind of relationship that price has with elastic goods. So there's an economic thing that goes on here with the pricing of inelastic goods. And because there are these very irrational economic relationships with inelastic goods, the government, both federal and state government, regulates them. And so higher education is part of that regulation. So you may wonder sometimes why we're so highly regulated as an academy, as an organization. Why is post-secondary education so highly regulated? The answer is because we are dealing with an inelastic good where there really is no available substitute. So the recent dialogue related to students is the part that I'm going to leave you with to think about, because this is where I get concerned. A lot of the language these days has started to make students as the product. So we're making workers, or a lot of the language that sometimes you'll hear state policymakers refer to, it's almost as if our outcomes, the product that we're making, is a student. And this gets tricky, because if the product is a degree, and the degree is anchored to academic programs, we have a lot of control over that with regard to pricing, with regard to quality, with regard to structure. Same thing with athletic programs. If your program is your product, it's a lot easier for you as leaders to really manage that program. If your athlete, however, becomes the product, not the consumer of the product, but the actual outcome, the product itself, it gets really hard. And so I'll just leave you with the thought that what happens when we begin to make students both the product of the academy and the consumer of the academy. Welcome your feedback there on the discussion forum. I look forward to hearing what you have to think there. I'll probably chime in my own ideas, but that's where I see us going, and I kind of get a little concerned about what's happening there. So that's all for part 2 of this presentation. The next time you see and hear me, we will go over very briefly some key points that I want you to draw out of Bowman and Dill's structural and human resource frames. But until then, take care, and I will see you online soon. Thank you.